we will now continue with another measure developed at Volvo Cars, and we're welcoming Mikael Ljung Aust back again, and he will now present the measure on nudging and coaching car drivers towards more ACC use. So we're up for another presentation from your side. Looking forward to it.
Woohoo! Finally. All right. So I'm Mikael Ljung Aust, for anyone possibly new to the session, and we'll talk about how to make people use adaptive cruise control more. First, I'll talk a little bit about why we want to do that. So if you click on to the next slide and the next one again. So some very basic principles, but worth repeating. If you want to have a rear-end collision, you need two things. You typically need a distracted driver in some way, and you also need a car in front. Now, there's a huge amount of discussion and research and proposals for regulation, etc., regarding the first, and various ways of, keeping people attentive, avoiding distraction, taking away the things that might make them distracted. Lots of work on that. But given this mechanism, you can have as good results by addressing bullet number 2. What we typically see in our accident causation research is really what happens is that you run out of time. You're looking away and something unexpected happens. So when your attention is back, there's just not time enough to deal with it. So one way of controlling for this type of risk is making sure that the car in front stays sufficiently far in front so that there always is time. So making people keep a decent distance just as an effective countermeasure against driver distraction as taking their phones away or whatever you think it is that is, the culprit, the thing distracting them. So, of course, that sounds good, right? So then the next question is obviously, now what? How do we make that happen? We just had a long session on coaching, and coaching is effective in many ways. But when it comes to some types of normal driving things, like if you spend a couple of 100 hours behind the wheel every year, and a large part of that is car following, you develop these autonomous or automated behaviors regarding how you regulate that distance, that they are really hard to get to in people. They are, a long session with a cognitive behavioral therapist may be the start, and it's not even sure that you can get through with that in that time. So difficult approach. Now, of course, the other approach is to make the car keep the distance for you, so you don't have to worry about it, because that's automatically regulated. This is much easier because we do have such a system. It's adaptive cruise control. So bottom line in this is, if you want to mitigate distraction, a highly viable solution is to make people turn ACC on and keep it on. So with that said, we can jump to the next slide. What we've done then is applied 2 different concepts. I'll tell you a little bit later why it's 2 and not just 1, which was the original idea. But suffice it to say that when it comes to nudging and influencing behavior, there's a subgroup of nudge types which are called ambient displays. And these are not super instructive regarding what they want you to do. And they are not giving a step-by-step, this is how you do X and then you do Y. There's no guidance of that kind. What they do is they mirror something else that happens. So, for example, there's a famous design lamp that is coupled to the energy consumption in a house. And when the energy consumption is low, it has this very beautiful shape. And when the energy consumption goes high, it morphs into something rather ugly with lots of stuff sticking out. And that's all it does. It changes its shape, and you know, maybe sometime you can figure out why that happens, or you're being told, but it's not in your face in that sense. So the first concept used for ACC is meant to be in that ambient display genre, if you will. And here is a bunch of screenshots from the app that we developed to implement this. And it leverages many people's, or most people's, desire for order over chaos. If you're the other kind of person, this will not work for you. What it does is that it has the car in the middle. It will tell you whether ACC is on or not, and then there's a bunch of dots flying around in a more or less random pattern. And when you turn on ACC and start using it, for every minute of usage, one of these dots will lock into place and stay put. And after 10 minutes, all of the 10 dots flying around will have formed this circle with 10 dots, and they're standing still, and you're like done for the day. Your goal for the day of 10 minutes of ACC use is reached. And then it stays that way for the rest of the trip. And when you turn the engine off, it resets. So next day, you start collecting these dots again. Of course, you can adjust the timing cycle to be every trip or every week or every something. For this study, I think we used every day, or every 24 hours to be precise. So this is one concept. And then if we click forward, so ACC has a very mixed following in the population of drivers. As a technology, some people are super happy to use it. Others are intermediately happy to use it, and some are directly unhappy to use it. The graph to the left is a ACC usage score from a field trial we ran a couple of years back. And this is meant to illustrate something we've found over the years. If you give, well, if you look into a fleet of a random number of cars, you will see that, like in the top of this graph, you'll see that you see that the red line is high up in percentage and fairly steady. That means that someone was using ACC a lot, in this case, almost half the driving time. Other people are more up and down, but what's interesting for this measure is that we typically see what's in the blue square down to the left, a bunch of flatliners. That is people who have ACC in the car and who never or almost never use it. So the original idea was that we would, get a random fleet of drivers from Volvo. For the ones who are already using adaptive cruise control, we would give them the ambient display nudge and see if we could increase their usage. But of course, if you're not using ACC, you can't be nudged because you don't have any usage to be reflected on. So the original idea was to turn these non-users into users using coaching with an in-vehicle app. So we did a bunch of pilot tests with an in-vehicle app that talks you through ACC activation while you're out test driving a car. It's really meant to address some of the fears you typically find when interviewing people who don't use ACC, which is they're kind of scared. They really don't know what's going to happen, and maybe the procedure isn't clear, but most of all, they are unwilling to trust this robot with their lives. So they don't want to chance anything. So this in-vehicle app that we piloted, it was a voice interaction thing. It talked you through ACC activation in very clear steps and with voice confirmation in every step. You know, this is what you do. Do you see this button? You should feel this when you press it. Are you ready to press it? That kind of super pedagogical thing. And that was great. And results were that a bunch of people who reported themselves as kind of determined non-users actually activated ACC for the first time in their lives, and we're rather happy about it. Now, the problem for the MeBeSafe field trial is that when we recruited those 49 drivers that I mentioned in the morning for the driver alert and the ACC field trial, we assumed that they would be similar to previously randomly recruited driver fleets. And so in that population of 49, we'd find, 10 or 15 people that were adamant non-users of ACC and who wouldn't be nudged, and therefore were really suitable subjects to be coached. In short, that assumption was wrong. There were some non-users, fewer than expected, and all of them started using ACC in the treatment phase. So we had this great setup where we would, adopt the pilot test to a more like Wizard of Oz setup, because there were some tech issues with talking people into activation. Very pragmatically, people are not interested in tech, don't listen all that well to someone speaking instructions over an in-vehicle app. But we have to abandon that idea because we didn't have any non-users to coach. So if we click on the next, I think I have this illustrated. Ta-da! Non-viable approach. Next. So, because the team that was doing the front-end programming of this was really excited and happy about what we were getting out of the ambient display concept, we instead changed directions and launched a second nudging concept. This is a more traditional leaderboard concept. You're scored based on how much you use ACC as a total portion of your total driving during the day. You get a ratio. While you're driving, you have the views over to the left showing that ACC is active and on and that you're collecting points. To the right is the scoreboard that's displayed at standstill, and it will give you your ranking or weekly status. And I think we struck a very competitive population, or found a very competitive population, at least a few people. We were contacted during the field trial when people had been driving, short trips late at night, and they were emailing saying, this particular trip, I can see it didn't register because my score didn't go up. Can you fix that? So it's competition obviously works. The setup, the field trial setup, we had 49 cars with these remote data collections, so we could actually track ACC usage over time remotely. Displays for the nudging app was these iPhone screens. I've shown them before. Baseline, same as before, 4,000 hours of driving in October, November. The first ambient display concept, that was done December to mid-April, and the second from that to August. So you see the numbers, but the first concept had a lot more, it's like 7,000 hours of driving, and the second one had 2,500 hours. Now in the large number of things, 50 cars and 4,000 hours, that's like 80 on average hours per driver. So a fair bit of driving, not a huge amount of driving, but still in terms of collecting stats on average driver behavior, we think that's sufficient. And again, to be clear, this is the same fleet as in the DAC incentive study. We have thought a lot about whether there's a correlation effect there. We have no reason to believe there is, but I'm happy to discuss that in the breakout session, in the sense that your likelihood of picking up on the DAC incentive would increase because you're being nudged by a ACC usage concept. But we can talk about that in the breakout session if anyone would go deeper or want to go deeper on that. So that was the long preamble. Now we can look at some results. If we go to the next slide. So the baseline data shows that these 49 drivers had about 14% average ACC usage of their total driving time. Compared to earlier data, that's an average. We would say that's typical for like a medium usage group. It's not a high usage level, it's not a non-user, it's a medium user. In treatment 1, this rose to 21% with the ambient display concept, so that's a relative increase of 46% by having these dots spinning next to the steering wheel and doing only that. In treatment 2, with competition involved, that rose to 31% compared to a baseline of 14, which makes for a 118% relative increase. So more than double the use of ACC to stay on top of this competitive leaderboard, or at least move in it. So rather like maybe surprisingly high numbers. Both for I mean, competition can really inspire the best or worst in people, but for something as everyday as driving and using one function more, we're a bit surprised to see this. And the ambient display actually working, there were some hesitancy that it even would have any effect, so we're glad it did. But these are the outcomes. You can actually push usage of a system like ACC through fairly simple means by adding some additional display info that reflects on your usage. So I think this is something that will probably come up a lot more in the future, where if now the question is how can we make sure ADAS systems have a large market penetration over time, then the follow-up question to that is obviously, okay, now that everyone has it, how do we make sure they're also used largely in the fleet? Also something to be pondered in the breakout session. So next slide, please. Now, of course, one question that pops into mind is whether these concepts affect all drivers similarly, or if there is differences. So we looked at that, and here you have from left to right, you have the percentage of increase in every participating driver ordered from most increase in the ambient display concept to the least increase, and the green stuff is the leaderboard nudge. Now, if everyone was influenced the same way, the relative proportions between green and blue would be identical for all drivers, and it's obviously not. Some people are more nudged by the ambient display, some people are more nudged by the competitive leaderboard display. So it's also clear that if you want to reach a whole population of drivers, you may need, or you will need more than one concept. You may need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 if you want to cover them all and make sure everyone is properly nudged. Also, you can see some drivers off to the far right who consistently respond negatively to nudging. So they drive less with ACC when nudged. Now, of course, it's small changes, and you know, in a trial of this size, possibly within the bounds of variability, but in a bigger population, assuming that effect still holds, which I think is reasonable, this also means that if you were to run a nudge on a fleet of drivers live, then it would be really good to monitor and see if their ACC usage actually is going down, because then you want to stop nudging them, or you want to switch to a different concept to see if they respond better, because it's not a good thing to take ACC usage out of the equation if you've established it's a good thing to have. So I think that's about it. And I think we had a lot of good response to these nudges, and it's a fairly simple type of implementation because you just need to, again, claim some real estate from the designers, and that's where the discussion is. So that was that.
Great. Thank you, Mikael, for this yet another interesting presentation on these measures.